Seizing central space immediately opens lines for rapid piece development and pressure. Instantly contesting central space, black signals an imbalanced battle and often leads to dynamic pawn structures. Instantly challenging black's queenside asymmetry, this knight's development prepares for kingside aggression and pawn advances. Solidifying central control and preparing for a nf6 development, this pawn push elegantly challenges white's knight. Opening up the bishop diagonal for a more flexible development. Preparing for a fianchetto, the bishop will soon control a long diagonal, potentially pressuring white's queenside. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure allows for a flexible development of white's pieces. Developing the bishop to its fianchetto square logically completes the pawn chain and prepares for potential kingside castling. Developing the bishop to g2 solidifies control of the long diagonal, aiming to restrict black's queenside development and prepare for potential kingside aggression. Developing the knight to f6 solidifies central influence and prepares for castling, aligning with the strategic goals of many Sicilian structures. Securing the monarch in its cozy castle offers immediate safety, preparing for a potential queenside expansion. Castling on the queenside now completes king's safety, aiming to activate the rook for central influence. Solidifying the pawn center to prepare for a potential d4 push, bolstering kingside safety. Developing the knight to a natural square, this piece prepares to influence the center and potentially challenge white's kingside pawn structure. Developing the knight to d2 sidesteps immediate skirmishes on the kingside, preparing to swing it over to the f3 square for enhanced central influence. Shifting the rook to the b-file prepares for potential queenside expansion or supports a b5 pawn push. Activating the rook on the e-file now prepares central pawn breaks and supports potential piece maneuvering. Challenging white's queenside pawn structure, black aims to gain space and potentially open the b-file for future pressure. Unleashing the central pawns creates a dynamic pawn chain, aiming to fracture black's kingside pawn structure and liberate the bishop on g2. Initiating a bold queenside pawn thrust, black immediately challenges white's central control and seeks to disrupt white's harmonious development before it solidifies. Asserting central dominance, white pushes forward, aiming to restrict black's queenside expansion and potentially exploit pawn weaknesses. Instantly opening the c-file for potential pressure, black sacrifices a pawn to disrupt white's central pawn structure and gain piece activity. Opening that central diagonal for the bishop offers immediate counterplay. Unleashing the knight to a central outpost, this maneuver disrupts white's pawn structure and prepares for an aggressive queenside expansion. Preparing to redeploy the bishop to the queenside, aiming for a more active diagonal and potentially reinforcing the queenside pawn structure. Opening up the c-file and threatening to double queenside pawns, black reshapes the pawn structure, initiating positional pressure. Preparing to unleash pressure along the central files, aiming to exploit the awkward knight placement. Rerouting the knight to a more active central outpost after the pawn exchange. Repositioning the knight to b3 aims to challenge the advanced knight on a5 and control the c5 square, potentially preparing for a central pawn push. The knight awkwardly hops to c4, seemingly seeking an outpost, but it surrenders vital central squares and creates a potential target for white's kingside attack. Preparing a queenside space grab, aiming to restrict black's minor pieces and potentially create weaknesses on the b-file. Bolstering the queenside pawn chain to prevent further knight infiltration, establishes a solid defensive perimeter. Initiating a knight maneuver to bolster the queenside presence and prepare for a potential central break. Swapping off the knight opens the d-file for your rook and initiates a central pawn break. Clearing the bishop's diagonal enhances pressure on black's queenside structure. Challenging white's queenside structure, this piece repositions for central influence and a potential kingside pawn storm. Opening the queenside gives your pieces freedom to operate while pressuring the unprotected pawn. Recapturing the pawn on d5 immediately loosens white's center and opens lines for your bishop. Liberating the d-pawn suddenly opens lines, challenging black's central control and creating dynamic imbalances. Seizing the open file with the queen after the pawn sacrifice, black immediately disrupts white's central control and aims to activate her forces. Sacrificing a rook to expose the enemy king's sanctuary offers immediate tactical fireworks, but watch out for the ensuing queenside counterplay. Boldly reclaiming lost material, black immediately challenges white's aggressive queen sacrifice by centralizing the rook. The rook retreats, abandoning the central file and surrendering queenside pressure. Reactivating the rook to h8 aims to contest the open file and add defensive pressure to the queenside. Asserting control over the file opens up critical lines for attacking black's uncastled king. A bold pawn push, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially open a file for the rook, though it weakens the kingside slightly. Initiating a pawn thrust on the kingside aims to pry open lines for the bishop and queen, potentially threatening the black monarch. Repositioning the bishop to e5 aims to control the central squares and prepare for potential future advances. Opening the queenside diagonal for the rook and potentially creating a passed pawn is a bold, albeit risky, endeavor. Securing the queen's retreat while preparing a potential counterplay on the c-file and strengthening the kingside defense. Shifting the bishop aims to contest the open file and disrupt black's queenside influence. Sacrificing the bishop for pawn structure damage creates dynamic counterplay. Seizing the open e-file, white aims to pressure the weakened king, forcing black into defensive maneuvers. Unleashing the rook's power on the third rank, this maneuver ignites threats and disrupts white's pawn structure. Unleashing the queen to the kingside attempts to exploit any weakness, but it leaves the d5 pawn precariously isolated. Awakening the dormant bishop unleashes tactical potential on the queenside flank. Relocating the rook to the second rank activates it for potential infiltration or defense, while also preparing for further pawn advances. A bold venture into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and perhaps even threaten the king. Aggressively asserting control over the open file, white aims to disrupt black's harmonious piece development. Sacrificing material here to break open lines offers remarkable dynamism. The rook now secures a vital open file, preparing for a potential penetration and putting pressure on black's relaxed position. Poking at the queenside, black seeks active counterplay and attempts to disrupt white's pawn structure. Opening the file offers a new path for your rook, aiming to exploit black's slightly exposed king position. Unleashing a daring rook maneuver, black aims to disrupt white's spatial advantage and create counterplay on an open file. The rook maneuvers, eyeing the vulnerable pawn and preparing to penetrate the enemy's defenses on the queenside. The rook capture sacrifices material for dynamic activity, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines toward the monarch. The queen's repositioning here abandons the queenside pressure and re-engages the kingside, potentially setting up tactical possibilities. The queen's relocation aims to reactivate its attacking potential and potentially disrupt the pawn structure, seeking counterplay. Securing the queenside pawn advance while preparing to activate the rook on the open file offers robust counterplay. Securing the king with this pawn push is a prudent defensive adjustment before black contemplates further pawn advances. Unlocking the queenside pawn's potential to disrupt black's king safety. Preserving the crucial queenside majority requires vigilance, as the rook now faces potential isolation. Shifting the queen to the queenside creates an immediate bind, threatening to trap the black rook and open crucial lines for attack. Unpinning the bishop from this exposed bishop allows for more active piece play. Seizing the queenside open file, this offers a crucial outpost for the queen and disrupts black's pawn structure.